Welcome to the Building Web3 Podcast. Today we're diving into the future of tech branding with Chris Neff, global head of emerging tech and Anomaly. Discover how billion-dollar brands like Gucci are leveraging Web3, the latest breakthroughs in generative AI, and the secrets to crafting marketing with cutting-edge technology. And remember, nothing stated here is financial advice. Welcome to the Building Web3 Podcast. Today I have my good friend, Chris Neff. He is the global head of emerging tech at Anomaly. Before we get too deep into what you're doing at Anomaly, could you give us a brief introduction into your background and what were you doing before you entered the Web3 space?
For sure. Well, thanks, Jax, for having me, man. I'm excited that we get to do this. My background, as you noted, global head of emerging tech now, which sort of indicates that I've been around technology my whole life. Emerging technologies, even before we sort of knew what they were. So just was somebody who liked to build computers as a kid, just sort of play with electronics, install home theater systems, just all kinds of various sort of forms of visual and audio that I could play with, projectors, things like that. And that sort of evolved and manifested. So, from a professional sort of route, I parlayed that into production, started off as a producer, right? So I would help to make sense of things, of ideas, help those become tangible, manage timelines, budgets, and scope, right? So there's sort of the three elements to make a production real. But my sort of superpower was bringing people together to realize those complicated things and ideally making them feel easier than they actually were. And then that kind of just evolved. I've been on really within sort of the marketing, advertising industry my whole career. Sometimes in various disciplines, in different sides of the equation. So I'm on the agency side, even though Anomaly is sort of, it's not an agency, but we're more like in marketing. We're a firm. We do a lot of like really cool things, everything from launching products to Super Bowl commercials. So it's a really interesting arena to play in, lots of modes and mediums. But I've also been on the production side, really help kind of build the production teams, lead the teams, both creatively, strategically, and then still have that sort of producer mindset in how I do things. Now I operate with, our offices around the world to really shepherd those brands and those individuals through some of this nascent tech. So obviously, you guys are masters in the Web3 game. So that's part of sort of what is still emerging, or facets of it are emerging and established. And then we have, whether it's kind of gaming worlds, spatial computing, some sort of interesting forms and factors where people are showing up and interacting. And then probably the massive crux of what I do, and I've really done the last 18 to 24 months, is in the generative AI spectrum, which has kind of been like all encompassing, all sweeping. We've really sort of transitioned from even technology to advancement. This is about how we as a people, live, how we perform, how we do our jobs. The factor, of all of that is changing and evolving. So emerging tech meets, as much sort of practical application as you can imagine, probably, from more sort of epic or bigger than, even maybe what do you think about, .com and what, e-commerce meant, like that transformative. So it's pretty great. That's me.
Absolutely. So let's get an example of what would you call it, like a campaign or like a brand solution that you would bring, so people can kind of visualize, because they hear the term marketing, they're like, what is that? Cold emails, that cold DMs? I assume it's something completely different.
It can be, right? Like marketing is a very general expression. As someone who has a marketing degree, it was a very general degree. It was a very general sort of education. Words, images, the way it's created and presented, the way it's then delivered and received. What does the recipient sort of do with it? Do they hear it? Do they act a certain way? Do they perform something? Does it elicit a certain feeling in them? Is it funny? Is it emotional? Right? These are all facets of quote unquote marketing. And then I think, really the biggest sort of turn that marketing made was from material to brand, right? Building sort of brand and presence and having beliefs and ideals and convictions as an entity, so that would come across on the page, that would come across in the deliverable. So, tangible examples, right? So yes, like what I do, yes, I don't focus on the direct mail or, even really the social media, website stuff, TV commercials. These are a little bit more of like I'd say typical packaging, right? So, the ways we see brands show up in the world. We do a lot of that at Anomaly, and we try to do it in a spectacular way. So we believe really in the creativity and the strategy, and then bringing that to life that is sort of true to the essence of the brand, sometimes also pushing the brands into new spaces, pushing users to experience things in a new way. That can still be done through more traditional modes and mediums. I tend to focus on really the untraditional sort of forms of it, playing with new technologies, new ways to show up, new form factors, right? So if we think about like to apply generative AI in a tangible way, this was like Thanksgiving, 2 Thanksgivings ago, I guess, back in 2022, we did a generative music video for a hip hop song that was for Ally Bank. The project was called Lyrically, and Lyrically was written by Charlie Curtis Beard. It featured Toby Lou, and it was all around sort of an educational curriculum that this influencer, Vince Hollerman, does on TikTok, right? So he's really good at teaching financial literacy through TikTok in engaging ways, helping people understand saving and spending, like how to have savings goals, short-term and long-term, things like that. So it was turned into a hip hop song. And then we used generative AI to actually create the form factor of the music video at a very early stage where generative animation wasn't really a thing. We were able to unearth it, create something, put it out there in the world so that it had visual to accompany the really great track. So tangible example, lived on social, used a really new form of technology in order to bring it to life. And that's, hopefully that sort of paints the picture.
Yeah, absolutely. And would that be like a runway ML? Like, what are you guys using generative wise if you're creating like a music video for a creator, for example?
So at that point in time, Runway Gen 1 wasn't even live. So their Gen 2 suite. So, and actually it was more like Runway was getting out there, sort of the Discord was available, it was coming, but because Runway co-created Stable Diffusion, with Stability. We actually worked with Stability, and the Stability team, close connection with them. We were able to access the Dream Studio animation API. So Dream Studio was really, and still is, a competitor to like Midjourney, so more generative visual. So it was an interface that Stability created so that you could harness Stable Diffusion. At that particular point in time, they had an animation API that wasn't public yet. It was being used more in research forums. And what was cool about it was it took, seed images and it actually stitched them together. And then it used generative imagery to create visuals that connected those images. So a little bit more in like the warp world, right? So there's something called warp fusion. And then it was Disco Diffusion. There was like different sort of forms or facets of it, which was more like taking an image and just kind of like warping aspects of it, colors, like morphing it, into something else. That was sort of the original form of, I guess, like generative animation. So it wasn't like, so what Runway does and what, Sora, you look at even like Luma's Dream Machine. So we're talking about very advanced sort of forms of moving imagery where it actually holds continuity with depth and space. It's not about just morphing from sort of one shape to another. Very, very advanced sort of form, and we're still very behind, I'd say, from a video perspective, but light years from where we were then. So our music video just has like this crazy kind of wacky visual feel as you think about moving from image to image. But Dream Studio Animation API via Stability. So
very, very interesting. So we talked about, kind of building brands and the brand. You work with obviously large brands. What is it that like is important to building brands? Because nowadays you hear like, okay, each founder essentially needs to be their own mini media company. They need to be posting on social media. They need to be out there like on Twitter Spaces. Or other people are saying like, oh no, build the brand around, some larger image or some larger like, company profile. Like how do you kind of approach brand building from the Anomaly, perspective?
Yeah, look, I think it's a really big question, and some of our brands are massively established. You think of like the Googles of the world. You're talking about an iconic brand that's been around for a while, and then there's other brands where we sort of launch products even within brands. So you think of like a new beauty product, right? That might sort of fall under the Unilever umbrella or Dove, or it might be sort of like a subset of that kind of has to now establish its own brand presence, its own thing, right? And usually what that means is like who are you appealing to, right? Who is your sort of target market or your primary consumer? Sometimes a brand might have a sense of that when they're establishing, but then also it's like they're gut checking that. We're using qualitative and quantitative research. We're testing materials. Like, does it actually appeal to this brand? Or other times it's like you're trying to enter a product to a new audience, right? So maybe the product category, maybe the core consumer is 45 plus women, right? And you're trying to say, well, what if we try to enter a Gen Z audience, a 30 or younger, same product. Now all of a sudden it's going to show up in a slightly different way, right? So it's we're sort of thinking like older millennial spectrum going to like either like more older Gen Z or younger. So the places that you show up, the sort of sometimes even like the style of editorial, the quick cutting, the movements, the messaging, right? Priorities and importance are different. Life stages are different. So you have to think about like as a brand. So sure, it's what are we conveying? How are we conveying it? Where are we conveying it? Right. So those are all sort of facets. And, again, even taking like really, really established brands, maybe you start to look at like risk and calculation and carefulness as well, because I think a lot of brands right now are they're hesitant, right, to make bolder statements. That's not to say that all of them are like that. And there are brands that make plenty of bold statements, take positions, whether it's politically aligning with, movements or cultures or ideals, right? Because again, it's like if you proclaim that you're a certain way as a brand, audiences expect that you double down on that, you triple down on that you still sort of go there. And if you soften those positions or you show up with other positions, right now we live in sort of a culture where all of that gets called out, right? So we've seen it sort of manifest. You can kind of go back in time and you can look at history of, there was a Kendall Jenner ad for Pepsi once upon a time, right? Like, so people will kind of show up. And if you look at like what social media does, it really galvanizes like negative, negativity. A lot of the tension that sort of just exists in our world can bubble up. There's almost like a mob that sort of goes after whoever they go after next, and then they kind of move on. We've seen it with Bud Light. We've seen it with brands. And I think that, from our perspective at Anomaly, we believe that a brand should be authentic and true to who they are. We believe that the marketing material should be authentic and true to that brand and that consumer. And I think, for us, like we deal with a lot of premium clients. We deal with a lot of premium products. Authenticity is really a core ingredient in premium, right? We've sort of enter a world where like, if you're inauthentic, it actually looks, it not only looks fake and fabricated, but it just looks cheaper, sounds and feels cheaper. Like you don't actually know me. Why are you sort of conveying that or showing up in that way? So any brand, big, small, new, old, needs to really get those ingredients right. And they need to have a lot of trust in who's helping bring it to life. And a lot of times for brands, when we work on really big brands, you're working with interagency teams as well. So you're working with a lot of, there's media teams and there's activation teams and retail teams. We handle creativity and strategy, right? So we're really helping kind of shape what the brand says, how they say it, how we convey it, those materials. But a lot of times we do work with other agencies in the mix, again, in those teams to really then help like make it show up and come to life. And it's really critical that there's a lot of trust between not only the clients and us, but also us and that interagency team and vice versa. And we all have to just make sure like, is this the right thing to do and say? And I guess the last sort of point to this is like in that calculation and that carefulness, sometimes it can take a lot of time. And sometimes the moment and the message that you want to get out is right now. So it's like, then you have to kind of balance like how careful we are, how pronounced we are with, the time. And it's like, if we really want to be calculated, that tends to take longer. Right. But sometimes it's in that moment, famous examples like Oreo showing up during the Super Bowl, right? The dunk in the dark, right? That needed to happen immediately. There was a timestamp. There was a significance. There's a cultural moment that's happening. How do we capitalize on it? We see this in meme culture. We see this all the time. It's like how many people are, showing the, playing off of Justin Timberlake's situation, sort of making kind of fun of that. Oh no, the tour is ruined, right? Like now that becomes a meme. It's in the zeitgeist. It's everywhere. It's applied, and now all of a sudden it's like you got to use it, but if you're a brand and you want to capitalize on that, you have to be okay with that. You have to know like, hey, if this is a moment, but sometimes what you do in a moment lasts, and it can have positive last or it could have negative last. So I'd say that's just what, you think about a war room or going into it with a brand, really shaping and being calculated. Like anytime something disruptive is going to be said or disruptive is going to be used, how long do we sort of have to craft and calculate what we're about to say and do? Because like then sometimes you get into edgy positions. Sometimes it's great. Sometimes it's not.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think most people will be wondering because you probably haven't seen that many entrants of like, we'll say one I did see recently was like Adidas was doing something with Coinbase, but you don't really see that many splashy big brand entrants into the Web3 space. So could you give us a bit of the current landscape for what are big brands thinking about in Web3 and like what have they historically tried, if anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to dissect Web3 a little bit in the different movements and the different forums, right? So if you think about, going back to like the initial coin offerings, you think about decentralized finance kind of coming up. The brands that sort of latched onto that were probably ones that like either were okay or accepting of decentralized currencies being part of like portfolios. So maybe finance companies, right? Or, the idea of like, hey, you could buy a Tesla with a Bitcoin. And that's not going back quite as far as ICOs, but you see what I mean. So as a form of a payment, let's kind of latch on to like a popular currency, a currency that can't miss, like a Bitcoin, and let's try to do something interesting around it. I think that the last bull run when it came to like NFTs, really a few different parts of the last bull run, but like, let's look at the NFT craze. I think the NFT craze was one that, I was in the middle of with a lot of brands. And I think that there wasn't as much hesitation with brands to show up because they felt they could just kind of jump in, mint something, sort of put something out. We were deploying a lot of free mints, creating a lot of things that maybe were on Polygon, less gas, a little easier to get out there, just sort of putting it out there. But you were trying to build a community. Largely, those brands didn't have communities in Web3. They're like, well, where are we showing up, right? So like an aggregate, like an OpenSea, our NFTs are going to be there because they're naturally going to be on chain. They're going to be there. We have to have something there. But then it was also like, do we have a social profile? Do we talk about NFTs in an Instagram, or on a Facebook? Or is it like, no, we really need to be on Discord now? And then it's like, but nobody really had a Discord strategy. And it's like, oh, well, what about Telegram? Which now I'd say still most brands aren't there. But it's like, what's the Telegram strategy? What's the Twitter? Now it's X. What's those strategies? So it's tough because, like at the core of it, it was like a lot of times within new tech spectrums or movements, right? It's these hype cycles. So largely brands aren't necessarily jumping into the hype cycle early. They're jumping in when like, hype is at its biggest, right? Where it's like, we have to do this. I can't stop hearing about it. We're missing out, right? That FOMO sort of comes in. We need to do a drop. We need to do something. Some of our brands, if I think about like our LVMH brand, and specifically like Remova and other sort of facets of LVMH did a really good job. Some like high-end fashion did a good job of coming up with partnerships. I think about the Remova partnership with Artifact. That was pretty cool. It was a custom branded case. They had like a nice experience where you could go on, you could interact, you could be eligible for a drop. Think about a lot of the moves that Gucci made. We sort of looked at those as like expert moves, right? So fashion already has like a sense of exclusivity. Exclusivity sort of lended itself really well to the NFT craze, especially like very, unique drops. I think a lot of them kind of got oversaturated, but let's look at like, if only 1,000 were dropped or 100 were dropped. Now all of a sudden you look at that exclusivity, which ladders well to like established fashion brands. So the NFT market kind of picked up. Brands grabbed it, but brands grabbed it kind of late, right? You didn't see a lot of like partnerships with Bored Apes from a big brand perspective. You saw it a little bit more with Clone X and Artifact, I think because of the Nike connection. Felt a little safer. It felt like a little closer to home. And then you saw all these, I think like what was really big in the last hype cycle was, reward programs started coming. And I mean, we explored several. We've actually put code to some of them. But what, I think you look at Hennessy and you look at Swoosh and you look at, Starbucks Odyssey. And I think there was MasterCard programs. There was other programs too. People started to say like brands were kind of like, well, by the time they got around, I think, to wanting to put their chips there, the hype was dying, right? We had already sort of hit June, July of that cycle. We're on this kind of downswing. Like everybody was sort of looking at, okay, I don't know if it's sort of right, but like we still want to show up. What do we do? And some of the metaverse splashes were then kind of happening, right? So it's like, we did Samsung 837X, which was building the 837 property in New York, recreating that, but in like a very spectacular, like unique way in Decentraland, so that when you entered our doors, it was something very, very different. Gravity, defying whatever sort of elements were there. I think that the metaverse hype became real, but it was about let's show up in a new space for the first time. Let's drop NFTs in a different way for the first time. So it was all about novelty and sort of riding hype, but establishing and then being able to ride. So like the brand programs that we sort of saw established, the metaverse worlds that we saw built, they're not here today, right? They didn't survive the trough. They didn't survive the downward spiral, right? So, and largely those programs were sunsetted. Why? Because they were expensive. They required money to maintain the community. The communities weren't necessarily built. And if you think of like what started to thrive on Discord, it was more like Midjourney, Stable Diffusion, Runway, generative AI kind of swept in, and gaming still maintained. But like, the Web3 programs or the Web3 platforms communities sort of went dark or kind of migrated, and brands didn't necessarily migrate with it. So there are some exceptions, but for the most part, like we think about Web3, we think about Web3 then, we think about harnessing sort of the moment. And I would say that there are some interesting movements in Web3 for this cycle. This cycle has a little bit more volatility, right? Like I think everybody kind of understands the hype. More brands showed up in the last bull run than the previous bull run. And some of those brands, are they going to show up again? Right? Like I'm sort of curious, like as just a fan of Nike, like, well, what is Nike's move next? Right? So like Swoosh, we sort of understand what is happening or happened with Swoosh, still sort of around in some context. Digital fashion, obviously still being a massive sort of spectrum. Digital fashion, avatars, sort of metaverse gaming, still there. Spatial computing has grown since. So like what is kind of the future there? I don't think the NFT cycle is really here. I think, things will be minted, but they're not necessarily the same forms of NFTs. They need more utility, which we've always talked about. So a brand has to figure out, well, what's necessary there? Or, showing up in different ways. Like maybe it's decentralized, AI, different ways to sort of track data. We've seen now like a lot of growth in creating fractional tokens and fractional ownership of real life things, rare cars, rare paintings. So that like manifestation or blending, the digital twin or the digital footprint of the physical thing still makes a lot of sense for brands that represent, custom goods or luxury. So I would definitely expect more of that to come. But if you're a brand that doesn't represent any of those things, you're outside the spectrum, right? You're going to look at it and you're going to probably say, I'm going to join this cycle in some capacity. I'm going to do something with hype, but I'm going to spend less, and I'm really doing it for the headline to kind of get in, to capitalize. Or you've said like, you know what, Web3 is not for me, and I'm going to ride other facets of technology. Maybe you're looking at Apple Vision Pro, spatial computing. Maybe you're looking at interesting, generative AI has its own crazy tensions and crazy issues, but maybe you're like, hey, we want to play with more transformative technology, get our house in order versus just experimental technology that gets headlines. Super long answer for your quick question. Apologies.
No, that was great. So let's look at, we'll call it like the dichotomy between the generative AI space and the Web3 space, because both of these are emerging technologies. They came out, and I would say from the people I've worked with, like I personally use generative AI every single day. Most people I know use it as well, but many people I know do not use Web3. And the only reason I know many people using Web3 is because I'm surrounded by the space and I chose to be in it. So why do you think like there is so much more utility that people are seeing in the generative AI space versus the Web3 space? Maybe DeFi is just not as compelling, or NFT trading is not as compelling.
Yeah, I mean, I think in part, so there's this distinction, right? And I've talked about hype some, and obviously hype is very much associated with Web3. It's associated with technologies, right? Hype cycles. .com boom went through a hype cycle, and then when it, so that hype cycle, that Gartner's hype cycle, when you think about it, technologies, most of them are sort of at their peak, right at the top of the hype cycle. All of a sudden it drops, kind of falls apart. Most of them go away, but then the few that do survive actually strengthen and go up, right? So we look at, it's important sort of note of like Amazon, right? So Amazon, famous article sort of published, who would buy into e-commerce, Amazon.bomb. That was in the trough, right? And we obviously know what's happened with Amazon since. So brilliant moves, nice scale, but like it didn't matter who you were. If you went through that trough, everybody kind of questioned, e-commerce and .com and internet, right? So I think it's important in the history of things to look at the age of AI, specifically Gen AI, but AI as a larger construct, and Web3, because hype cycles are usually like there's super cycles, and then there's like, elements to what the cycle is primarily representing, but then there's a broader sort of tech spectrum that goes through its own cycle. So AI has been around longer than cryptographic encryption, than blockchain technology. It just has. It's been around. It's really like even predates, personal computing, and it's more like NASA sort of space engineering, like primitive forms of machine learning or computation, like that's there, right? So it's been around a lot longer. So it's at a much more mature place. And if you look at sort of some of these cycles, when I first started playing with generative AI, I think it was back in like 2012, 2013, you had things like GANs, you had TensorFlow, you had some of these systems that you could build your own, boxes, you could train your own models. It's very, very bad though, in terms of what we could get out of it, right? So we had to kind of do our best to like push it. Computer vision, which was, just a computer sort of to understand what you were showing it, and then being able to sort of read and react to that. That was always a little bit better, right? So that was further ahead. And now computer vision is sort of deployed everywhere. It's more government. It's kind of, it's a little less in like pop culture, and it's a bit more like systemic because it's been around longer. It's matured. But if we look at Gen AI and we look at sort of what this new phase or evolution is, it's really an evolution in user experience, right? So at that point in time, you needed to build a computer, put these like Titan X NVIDIA graphics cards in them, which could just, really handle a lot of computing. Sometimes you needed to build $4, $5, $6, $7,000 PC in order to properly like ingest the data, train the model. The models were very primitive, what the computers could sort of do with it. So like natural language, which is the basis of, ChatGPT. When you use ChatGPT right now, the way it can formulate and describe language is so sophisticated, as is the experience of using it. It's so easy to log into ChatGPT and just go there with that prompt box and start talking to it. So it's an evolution in user experience, an evolution in all of the computing that fuels it. So that makes it scale like wildfire. So yes, the models are more sophisticated, the computational power that goes into them, but the interfaces and the user experience is so much more advanced. So when you sort of step back and look at Web3, a lot of times you want to try to go get a new NFT, a new wallet, right? You're spending a lot of time, right? And it's like sunk time. It's like, it shouldn't be that complicated, right? It shouldn't be that complicated to, well, what do I do with my passphrase? Like, where is it safe to put that? Why can't I use this wallet for this new coin I heard about, right? Why isn't it compatible? Oh, now I need to go get a new wallet. What's the difference with cold and hard storage? And then it's like a metaverse. Some use wallets, some use email. Like, there's so much sort of specificity to these systems And overall, what does it do is it creates like a convoluted and a messy user experience, right? So it needs sophistication in its UX. It needs to go through that, but we're not there yet. So, and that may not even happen during this bull, although some more technologies will be advanced. You know, you can already see sort of progression in wallets and holding and trading and sharing. You can see a lot of cross-chain solutions, which is critical because people don't ultimately need to feel that they're on the blockchain. The assets are on the blockchain. It's just sort of safety that they're there, right? Or there's transparency and elements that they're there. But hiding the blockchain, hiding the chain, cross-chain compatibility, like these are all sort of facets where, you're engineering solutions to work together so that it's like a very easy in, a whole lot of cool machine working, and then a simple, response out, right? Right now, you feel every step of a Web3 system. You do, like and there's friction at every step sometimes, or the output is way less than you expected it to be or inferior. So like it's so easy to then live in hype, and it's very hard to become sort of necessary, right? So there's Peter Thiel has this, 0 to 1 frame, right? So famous, more modern book, Entrepreneurship. But what's important about it is like a lot of like horizontal innovation versus vertical, right? So a lot of people are just kind of like building upon what's already there, right? Innovating, but more so like through iteration. Like, oh, it's this, it's this, it's this. It's like, it's a little better, it's a little better. But like a vertical leap, like a big jump, right? Something very new. So like cryptographic encryption, right? Or when you think about like a true decentralized currency, big leap that Bitcoin made. Although it was a little bit of like a stack on other decentralized currencies, a better form of it, it was at least a leap in technology, right? So you can see that it necessitated something different, right? It was transparent, it was safer, it was decentralized. These are sort of the same pillars that everybody uses for everything else in blockchain and in Web3, but the other ones don't necessarily have the same necessity, right? You don't really see the value, or like you can't feel it, you can't deploy it the same way you can. And we've run into this with even Ethereum, right? If I kind of go from 1 to 2, it's like Ethereum, beautiful in sort of the sense of decentralized, beautiful in the sense that like what it could mean in terms of minting and establishing, right? Like as this base layer that people can stack upon. Great, you can have ownership, you can build, but there was a lot of friction across it, right? Fears that it could scale, a lot of sort of needs for iteration and improvement. And then obviously you started, that opened up the door for a lot of competition, right? We're going to, create our own layer zeros that have more sophistication than Ethereum, right? Which again, it opened the door for either stuff that was like built on top of the chain, a side chain, or completely new chains. And we're getting to a point now where there's just so many chains that it's a question of like, that's why cross chain is important. That's why like this integration is important, but you still have to create the new thing with it, right? You still have to, this vertical sort of leap to say like, this is necessary, right? If all of our licenses, right, our social security cards or our passports, our VIN numbers, like if all of these antiquated systems of tracking and data were on the blockchain and we held them in a wallet, it would be necessary to have a wallet. You wouldn't be able to store it without it. I need to read your wallet in order to see your VIN number or your title. I need to read your wallet in order to scan you, to let you onto an airplane. That, these are necessary. But because like, a lot of where blockchain can benefit is in antiquated systems like government, which are the slowest movers on the planet. Like you have this really sort of counter, problem, right? Where it's like, damn, like they could benefit tremendously from the adoption of like transparent, better encrypted systems. But yet like trying to get government on blockchain, we've seen, we see all these sort of issues. Like they can't get out of the financial sort of side of it in order to like talk about, the possibilities of the technology or integration. They're too busy sort of worrying about securities and rug pulls and wash trading and all the stuff that just feels like really, impossible yet possible to be happening, that they can't actually see sort of the benefits. So, for me, I do see a lot of benefits in Web3 technologies. I do see a lot of, but I also like, I wonder how much of like the purest sentiment, like i.e. like transparency, decentralization, I wonder how much that is necessary to make the leap, right? Because it's like, encryption, security, ease of access, speed of transaction, you know, these are sort of the things that to me are more defining than like, I don't think as many people care about decentralization or like that it's publicly available. And in fact, I think publicly available or the ability to check from a public versus the private sector actually scares a lot of people. And it's like, again, it's like, so what's necessary? What are we prioritizing? We want to make leaps. We want to grab adoption. We need to access users. We need non Web3 people to come to the party, which is why Ton is having so much success, right? If you look at like all this market volatility, and I keep watching Ton, and I'm just like, Telegram has a huge user base outside of the US, my understanding, because I'm in the US, so I can't access the app in this way. But the app is a wallet, right? And various things that you are subscribed to or into on Telegram can drop you currencies, right? The same way my wallet is publicly available and I get all kinds of crazy meme coins all the time. You can actually get things with utility and real through Telegram. Telegram is easily converting its users that are primarily sort of Web 2, world, because we're all still in this Web 2 world, to sort of simply sort of moving on to Web 3, demonstrating utility and dropping them things. And if you think about that, like it is a bit of a share of wallet game. It is a user game. But like it's also about easy movement, right? It's really important to kind of note, like you want somebody to make a leap, right? You're going to need to do it with them. You're going to need to walk with them. Right? It's like, yeah, okay, I'll feel it out. I'll let you try it. Let's demo it. Let's go there. So you always have to, it's like if you're trying to sell this really shiny new leap in technology, I want you to walk there with me. I want you to take me from where I'm comfortable to where I'm uncomfortable, and I want to feel what that's like. How tense is it? And a lot of times in Web3 spectrum, that walk breaks. It flails. But it's also flailed in like gaming and demos of new Apple tools and Microsoft. Famously, like things that Bill Gates would demo would crash, right? You think about Elon Musk hitting the truck window and it's shattering, right? Like we're not absolved to that as a norm, but in Web3, it's already a little scary when you start. You're a little bit more uncomfortable when you start. So we really have to figure out the simplicity and the path, and we have to make sure that the journey is supportive. And I think, that takes product experts. It takes user experience expertise beyond business development, because some Web3 companies have amazing business development. They can sell anything. But then when the users actually get in and start playing with it, they're like, this isn't what I expected. This doesn't work the same way. When are these new features coming out? Oh, at some point, and that's just like, I'm putting a lot of issues out there. I get it. A lot of problems. Right? But like, again, start with where someone's comfortable, walk them to where they're uncomfortable, understand product, understand user experience, and really like white glove service them to this point. And then if you get them to the product and you can iterate on the product and make it better and better and better, you'll get to the point that generative AI is right now, which is an incredible product, sort of magic, and then like really sound product UX and experience layer supporting it.
Absolutely. I mean, there's so many things I want to touch on there. Let me first talk about how users are currently experiencing crypto. Maybe they go to Coinbase, then they're immediately, if they want to send funds and like use one of these DeFi protocols, they have to decide which network to send it over. God forbid you send it on the wrong network, you might lose your coins. Then maybe you have to download MetaMask, send the coins there. Oh, the coins didn't show up. It's because you didn't import the wallet address or have the weird setting on that automatically imports. So there are just so many snafus that lead to crypto. And then Telegram comes out, and 900 million users. They have the wallet natively in the platform. People are already familiar with the ideas of wallets. It's not a new concept to have like your credit cards and money. So I really think people underestimate the UX part, and we always talk about how difficult it is. It's when you're using a Web2 app, you're not like, oh wow, all these Ajax calls are going out, and like, oh, all these like APIs are underpinning it. It's like, no, you just use the app. You don't need like it should. The best things are kind of invisible. And you definitely touched on that. And I just want to reiterate that. Like, there's two things I see: is one is TON, and two is the smart wallet from Coinbase, which I think could make great strides. But those are really two of the only things where I see like, okay, this would actually get the normies in.
Yeah, and they're it's working, right, to a degree. And you also have the fact that Coinbase publicly traded, that helps. There's some establishment there. I think regulation would be big. I mean, this was touched on a few years ago. This was touched on. I think Mark Cuban touched on it. A few other more entrepreneurial, billionaires were just like, we need Web2 money. We need pensions. We need funds. We need all of the money that can't roll into Web3 to come in, and regulation is going to do that, right? So government, ETFs, obviously a step in the right direction. I think that's good for the most part. I'm not as sort of familiar with like the downside. I know the risks of investing, but sort of the macro downside, I'm not as clear with ETFs. But it does start to open up institutional money. Institutional money is key, right? So you have to think that Bitcoin is going to be the first thing that's opened up, and that's going to probably set it up really well. But the ability for again, pension funds, institutional money, massive amounts of money to pour into these spectrums. That's what's needed, because it can't just be, every hype cycle, more and more Web3 people come back, right? For the most part, even those that have been burned, and we've all been burned, you come back, but you're not necessarily bringing quite enough people with you. So it is increasing from a bull run standpoint and a cycle to cycle, but we need like a bigger unlock, like a massive unlock, and institutional money is sort of there. And I think to your point, like, a lot of it is going to come in like product expertise, less friction, sort of hiding the blockchain, utilizing Web3 without even realizing utilizing Web3, and then regulatory steps that just make it a little bit safer for not only like people to play, but also brands, right? Because, I think Web3 needs brands for it to scale. Brands drive culture, right? They often sort of unlock new technologies, new facets, right? If brands are willing to play, like we saw sort of in the luxury side, digital fashion side, right? And we've seen it sort of in the finance side, but it needs more than that, right? There's so many other sort of facets of brands. You think of like QSR, right? Quick service retail. You think about food, Domino's, Burger King, McDonald's, Taco Bell, like these, Jimmy John's, right? These are brands that like could really capitalize on Web3, and they dabble in Web3, and they've sort of done like little drops and stuff. But like, there's a gamification to that type of food that fits really well, and there's a price point that fits really well with the Web3 consumer. Like, so how do you get like kind of those brands, massive brands, to sort of like pioneer new adoption, new systems, right? How are their apps integrated with wallets, right? Holding passes and access points and the ability to, so that's where I think, again, rewards, there is something to Web3 rewards for brands. We just didn't get over the hump with the last cycle, right? And unfortunately, some of the programs that were established didn't survive. But like, I still think that Web3 rewards is an area, but the apps, the systems, the minting, the sharing has to be better product, better UX, and then maybe you could get there.
Yeah, absolutely. You talked about getting the institutions on, and many people when they hear the institutions, they're thinking like BlackRock, Morgan Stanley. But yeah, to your point, the brands also have massive pools of capital, and there's potential use cases. And I like what you said earlier, where if you track the AI time spectrum, it kind of felt like to the normie that ChatGPT came out of nowhere. But if you're actually tracking the space, it's been developed, and we're still very much in the early days of Web3. So I'm excited to continue building this. So where can listeners kind of learn more about Anomaly, get involved with you?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely I speak and do some various things around at conferences. I mean, Anomaly, we're always putting out work. We have our website, and we're part of the Stagwell family as well. So Website's probably a good way, and then via our social channels. I'm probably most active on LinkedIn in terms of my place for social. I am on Telegram. I am on Twitter. I'm probably more active on Telegram than I am on Twitter, but those are spaces for me. I think the LinkedIn reach out, so it's a really good one. I'm open to the Telegram reach out, although I get a lot of spam there. I'm sure as you do too, Jax. It's a bit of an interesting navigation. Same with like WhatsApp. That's why I think I like LinkedIn a little bit more, because it's qualified. I'm a millennial. I've been using it for a while. But I'm open to forms of connection. I don't necessarily love the company solicit. We get that a lot. We can build stuff for you. We can do this. I'm open. Obviously, a great way to come is always when it's a recommendation. Somebody I know says, hey, there's this tech that you got to look at. Also have a lot of sort of industry friends within Web3 that feed me sort of new technologies, connected to some of the portfolio companies as well. So those are all different ways. I feel like we're in a world where if somebody really wants to get me, they will. It's
well, in a positive sense, hopefully.
Hopefully in a positive sense. But like we're kind of out there, It's like the connection is present. So it's a question of like, well, what's your entry point? Where do we begin the conversation? How relentless are you in the pursuit of that connection? And it's about timing. Sometimes people reach out. I'm just super busy. Some people reach out and I have a moment and it's like, great, let's connect. So that's why I think it's nice to, if you don't, reach out, you don't give me the first time, like, let's try again. A busy person, have 3 kids, a lot of responsibilities. So I'm not always on as much as people might say they're always on. I'm not. I love living the rest of my life as well, but I am thrilled to connect, and it's great to do this with you, Jax.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for coming on here. And everyone, I know the builders and founders will all have very good takeaways from this episode. So to everyone at Building Web3, let's get back to it. And thank you for coming on here, Chris.